Welcome. We are live with SCI TV. I'm Joshua Gordon, the founder of the Sports Conflict Institute. Today I'm joined by one of my favorite people in the world, Dr. Ken Pendleton. Ken, how are you today?
I am doing well, Josh, and I'm happy to be back on. It's been a
And we're
while.
almost at Halloween, as I can see from the decorations behind you, so people know this is live, current, and with current events comes a conversation we never thought we'd have, but we're going to be talking about Donald Trump a little bit here today.
Okay, let's. It seems like a perfect time of year to talk about a subject that's potentially scary.
So one of the things that came out in the last couple of weeks here was this concept of some of Trump's words being characterized as locker room talk, and a lot of athletes bristled at this pretty quickly and said, "Look, that is not the way we talk in locker rooms." And there's pushback, and there's been a lot of public conversation about, well, what is locker room talk? What is locker room culture? And what was it that Trump actually said, and how does that compare or contrast in there? So I thought it'd be a really nice thing for us to start. You've written recently on this. Maybe you could unpack a little bit about what is locker room culture from your perspective, and then let's see where this takes us.
I don't want to say there's no common ground between the two, but I think we need to be very clear about there being a distinction between what Trump said and what occurs in a locker room. So the first thing I'd want to point out, I think, is something pretty obvious. When you watch the videotape, when we think of a locker room, we think of the tension before a game or the kind of constant pressure to improve and all the, and we can get back to that and unpack that. What makes it distinct. But Donald Trump was on the way to being doing a guest appearance on a soap opera, right? So this was, this was really guy talk on one level. But the idea that this was anything like a locker room culture is actually something fundamentally different, right? And so let's start with the comments that were made by a couple of athletes. One was Chris Conley suggested that hadn't been in every locker room, but he simply didn't hear this kind of behavior in locker rooms. He hadn't witnessed it himself. And if we take that seriously, which I think we should, that lesson is we shouldn't stereotype the behavior that goes on in a locker room. And I've talked to more than one female who said to me, is this really the way guys talk? Is this really what occurs? You guys just shield us from this when you're around us? And the answer I've been able to give unequivocally is no. Ron Darling, who went to Yale, pitched for the Mets, he said, yes, I've heard everything in a locker room. And he goes, but I've also heard those things in boardrooms and other all-male environments. And so I think he's making a really interesting point that this isn't something about locker rooms in particular. This was something about when guys are by themselves. But he's also saying this is by no means something that's that is a common occurrence in society, right? So let's start with the guy talk part of this, and then we'll get to the locker room part of it. So the guy talk part of it, I'm just going to say, from we'll call it anecdata, if you will, to use the term they like to use on 538, that I've heard guys objectifying women and saying things about how women look, checkbox. Hear that all the time. Guys talking about how women want to experiences they've had with women, and sort of playing out how fantasies, playing out fantasies to other guys. I hear that sometimes. I've never heard guys talk about in a way where they would be bragging, or in any context talk about predatory behavior. Now, never mind whether they did the predatory behavior. I've never heard a guy, if they did do it, I would imagine I've never heard a guy who felt a need to talk about that behavior, right? Or felt a desire to talk about that behavior, right? And so what Darling is really saying here is, I'm not saying that never occurs in locker rooms, but that's really the darkest recesses, the darkest corners of man caves, right? That is just something that is not occurring and is not about locker rooms at all. It's just that I don't doubt that there are some really troubled men on the margins of society when they get together who would be comfortable about talking about such a subject, but it is not about locker rooms.
Yeah, it's very interesting. When I'm listening to you speak on this, I'm thinking back to my baseball days of yesteryear. And I remember one team I was on in particular, everything that was going on around us was full of profanity. Lots of swearing, lots of profanity, lots of lewd comments. But the moment when we were on a trip and one of our teammates did in fact cross a line when we were out the night before, he was gone from the team. immediately. And he did cross that line. He did go into Trump territory where he was bragging about behavior that was predatory, and we want no part of him. And it wasn't even a gray area for anyone on the team that lewd remarks and dirty humor and some of this, while maybe a different culture than you might have if you're in a more formal setting, or even perhaps a mixed gender setting, that the behavioral implications of what was being said was so clear to anyone involved that we want no part of this individual. Nobody was embracing him, and he was gone.
And that's a really encouraging story, right? That there was essentially like a self-cleansing within the environment that occurred. And I think it's really, I think again that gets back to Chris Conley's comment. There might be locker room environments where those kind of comments or someone saying they did something, bragging about doing something, would be tolerated. But there are also environments where that would not be tolerated. And that really speaks to the importance of creating the right kind of locker room culture, having the right kind of captains on your team, the right kind of coaches being involved to the extent they can. And it sort of ties back to the most controversial locker room incident in recent times, which is the Richie Incognito incident with Jonathan Martin and the Miami Dolphins, where Richie Incognito was using all sorts of abusive language, but it went beyond that into behavior. And what I found interesting is a lot of players on other NFL teams said, well, we've heard that language sometimes. But on the other hand, a team with the right kind of leadership would never have let this situation rise to the level it did, right? They would have made sure the culture essentially cut that off and said, Mr. Incognito, we're not going to allow you to behave like that, use that language, let alone actually take that kind of action towards a teammate.
Yeah, it's very interesting that line. A lot of the public conversation for me has been a little bit disturbing because it's been very focused on the words themselves and not what it's actually communicating. And I do think we're in an era right now where there's a lot of sensitivity about language being used. There's some real good upside to that because it draws people into having conversation about what is and isn't okay and what kind of impact it has on people. But sometimes we get caught where we're stopping at the surface level and the words themselves and not trying to pick apart what actually is being communicated. In Trump's situation, to me, in my sensibilities, it wasn't about the language. He could have said it without profanity, but communicated the same action, and I would find it as reprehensible. So, and yeah, he could have sworn like crazy and not been talking about anything particularly substantial, and I wouldn't have found it troubling at all.
Yeah, no, I think there's a feminist scholar named Andrea Dworkin, and she is she's a quote radical feminist, end quote, but she draws a distinction between what she calls pornotopic worldview and a misogynist worldview, and she argues that there's a certain kind of pornography that is about fantasy, right? It's about women wanting to do stuff with guys, and I'm not going to go into detail for obvious reasons here, but I think we all know what I'm talking about. But she said that there's a second kind of pornography that is misogynist, where it's about exercising power, degrading women, being able to basically do what you will with women without their consent. And what was expressed clearly fell into the latter category, right? And again, we're a sports group, and we're talking about locker room talk. And I think if we're going to try to link the two, just to summarize, no one can argue that those kind of things couldn't or don't occur in locker rooms to some degree. But I think Chris Conley's point is that that's by no means the norm. And so it'd be very dangerous to stereotype. And Ron Darling's point is that's not exclusive. That is not about locker rooms per se. That is about, there are other aspects where men, especially men with power, are left by their lonesome, and they can express things that most people would be absolutely embarrassed. If they did do those things, they certainly wouldn't brag about doing them. And so I think those 2 points are really important to keep in mind.
Yeah, certainly the framing of this as locker room talk is an attempt to make it seem as though it's no big deal. And the question back to you, Ken, is why wouldn't that be a big deal in any setting, right? I mean, that seems like a very dismissive characterization. If we're talking about sexual assault, then the framing shouldn't have any impact on where it occurs. So, even if you were to take Trump's assertions that locker rooms are just these bastions of filth and sexual assault confessions, how would that lessen it? right? Shouldn't we have a greater expectation than that for athletes or anyone?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think there are the two most common responses, which were given by Mr. Trump at the debate, by Melania Trump in the interview she did this week. The first was, let's get to the real issues. And that sort of struck me as odd, because how can the idea that you're bragging about engaging in predatory behavior towards women not be a real issue? I mean, if I was a woman, I would certainly be concerned about the idea that someone in a felt comfortable when they didn't think they were being recorded. Two people who are very powerful, Donald Trump and Billy Bush, expressing those kind of attitudes in that kind of right, if you will, to behave that way, right? That would be the first thing that struck me as is really, sort of, the idea that I'm sorry, this doesn't belong on the same page as just discussing the Affordable Health Care Act or Obamacare, depending on what you want to call it, or how we should handle ISIS. I'm sorry, how we should actually address 53% of the population seems like a very important issue, how we should behave towards them. The second thing is the men can't help themselves. Boys will be boys. And so it's a belief that there is just human nature, right? We can't help it. We inevitably want to engage in predatory behavior towards women. And I think we can empirically demonstrate that view is just false. Now, I'll use the example from a different profession. When I was a graduate student in philosophy, I once heard the chair of a department a female chair of a department talk about how it was commonplace 25 years ago, not to date myself, for men to engage in predatory behavior towards her colleagues, philosophers, to be in training or already tenured faculty, to try to hit on her, to go beyond hitting on her at conferences, right? And she described it as ghoulish, and in front of all the graduate students, both male and female. And I've seen behavior in the classroom then where male professors would say things of female students like, I think the only reason a woman is a graduate student because she's hoping to meet a professor, right? Well, if it really was true that men just can't help themselves and they did those things, that would still occur today. And I can tell you in academia right now, that doesn't occur like that anymore, right? I'd be willing to bet a lot of money that the instances of predatory behavior and even of more milder forms of sexual harassment are far fewer. In other words, this is not male nature, right? This is about how society constructs how we should respond to gender relations, and they obviously can evolve or devolve. And so I just don't accept that argument. To me seems absolutely wrong, demonstrably wrong. You can just look at the evidence and go, this idea that there is such a thing as man, and what it means to be a man is that you actually pursue women through means fair or foul. It doesn't resonate with my experience. It doesn't resonate with what we know about the evolution of the subject. And so I think we should, what we're seeing here is expressions of views that have long been disregarded in most aspects of society.
Yeah, I was taking on the subject in an MBA sports law class the other day with my students, and we were talking about sexual harassment, and folks trying to figure out, well, where's that line? What language can and can't be said in the workplace? Is it different if it's a locker room, right? Because the locker room oftentimes is a workplace, and trying to figure out that whole idea. And there's a real concern for some of the students about, am I crossing a line if I just swear? Again, I think they're missing the point until we got to a better place, which is a lot of it comes down to what is that overall culture? Are we creating a hostile work environment? Are we using language that is going to limit someone's ability to engage in what they do and make it a place where they can't have the equal opportunity that they actually deserve and should be a part of, right? And the language that we are hearing from Trump, to me, clearly crosses that line where anyone, male or female, frankly, who were to work with him should feel uncomfortable with the type of culture of that work environment that's going to be created there. Right. And so to me, swearing is cathartic. Sexual assault is anything but.
Right. And I think swearing is not, there's no power relationship to it. There might be a sensibility relationship to it. I have one of my roommates when I was an undergraduate is now the chair of a physics department, and he's also an evangelical. And he definitely does not like the idea that their swearing occurs at department meetings. And he also doesn't like the idea that alcohol is consumed at their Christmas parties. But on the other hand, it doesn't in any way, he may make him uncomfortable and irritated, but it doesn't make him feel disempowered in that context, right? Whereas if they were making remarks about evangelicals be by nature unqualified to be physicists, that would be might be a different issue, right? And so I think you may not like the culture, the things that are said, and the way they're said, but there's a big difference between that and making comments that essentially presuppose a power relationship between one group and another, right? And what made the Jonathan Martin Richie Incognito situation so disturbing was that you have a veteran player, and he can use the language coupled with action to actually exercise power over a teammate, right? Who's in a much more vulnerable position. And I don't think that has much to do with swearing by itself. Now, if the swearing was accompanied with certain other actions, like where you were always directing it at that person at the worst possible times, I could imagine, if you did it in front of the person's wife or children, that might have a different meaning. But to do it in the locker room in and of itself, as it normally doesn't have a power dynamic to it. So I think that's really the key thing you have to always understand. I would add one other thing too, that it really has to do with history. I don't think, for example, that if you were heterosexual, you're going to have much problem with someone who's gay making fun of you for being heterosexual, because you still have all the power in society, right? The words don't have the same meaning. And I'm reminded of an African-American professor who once said to me, there's a difference between a bigot and a racist. And he goes, I know lots of black people who are bigots. They don't like white people. They don't trust white people, but they don't have enough power to be racist. And he was trying to say that, in other words, racism is bigotry coupled with the power to do something with that bigotry. And so that's the context that when you apply it back to what Donald Trump said, you have to be aware of the fact that he has that power, right? People like him, and I don't want to single him out, but people who are in that position have the power to really take, let's say, a misogynist attitude and then and really make a woman's life far worse and really do harm to that person. Right. And that's I think at the bottom of this, we need a really subtle understanding about power, language, and history if we're going to really address these issues.
Even with all this, I have to say I remain an optimist. Anytime I've experienced it in this industry, in the sports industry, I've seen it from folks who are Trump's age and tend to be white males, frankly. Where I've heard comments that I go, whoa, that absolutely crossed the line, and I want no part of it. The folks coming up who are really reshaping this industry and the space, whether it's coaches, athletes, or the folks supporting it from a business perspective, I'm optimistic that this is not the norm, and this is not what we expect.
Right. And this gets back to something we've talked about before, this assumption that sports is so fundamentally different that rules that don't apply in normal contexts do apply in normal context, don't apply in sports. And one of the things in the article I published on your site, I argued is that there really are three fundamental distinctions between what occurs in the locker room and what occurs in, say, a normal workplace setting. The first is that there's a kind of hyper aggression that's considered necessary for success, and because of that, we tolerate behavior like Richie Incognito's often, because we think that this is what's going to be necessary for people to perform well. So you think of someone, never mind to really, strip away the homophobia, the racism, the hazing, but the idea that you slam your helmet against a locker before a game, or the way you have a pregame speech before a really big game and you see the things that are said. The second thing is there's the level at which the way in which you can be critical of people is unlike most work environments. If you listen to the famous Bobby Knight halftime speech on YouTube, there probably aren't many work environments where you would see someone unleash 19 F-bombs in a matter of 2 minutes at all of his employees at the same time. And those two come together, and what they really say is, because success in this world is about things like aggression, intimidation, it's as much emotion, it's about emotional commitment. We therefore have to unleash all these emotional expressions we have to allow them, because we want these guys to be one part human, one part animal. And that animal parts, we've got to cultivate that. The third part, and I think the scariest, gets back to the story you told, which was a very positive story, which was because the goal, the goal is for our team to win, there's an incredible amount of tolerance and diversity and intolerance for diversity as long as that guy's helping our team win. So we may think that guy is a pig. We may think, I don't like the attitudes he expresses, but there's a natural tendency to say, you know what, if this guy's going to help our team win, I'm not really concerned about his character issues, right? Because he's doing the business for us. And so I think these things are really cautionary tales. If I would, it could lead to big trouble. And this is why I think if you're a coach or you're a general manager, you're an athletic director, you've got to think about how combustible an environment this could be if you let it run amok. And I think of the University of Houston football program in the early 90s. Their coach actually interspersed pornography into game films. So his way of motivating his players was they'd show a really good play going on, and then they would show some pornographic scene from a film. That, this is a classic case where there was clearly a lack of oversight or control going on here for this to occur. And of course, it ended up really haunting Houston's program. And after that coach left the program, they went into a long period of decline that they really only arrested recently with Tom Herman. And so there is the locker room is a place, because it's an all male culture and you have all these incredible demands that you don't have in most aspects of society, could be given to this kind of behavior. It's more susceptible to it even. But I want to repeat, it's not inevitable, and two, it had very little to do with what Donald Trump said or did. Right, that was just a convenient way of labeling it because we think of locker rooms as the most male of sanctuaries.
And I would add as a final thought that when we think about locker rooms, we can't think about them as just this organic, culture that happens to either foster or fester depending on where you want to go, but that these are cultivated and curated work environments to get a task done. And to think about what kind of mechanisms can coaches put in place or others put in place to make sure they're safe. There's some really good organizations working on in this space. There's a group called You Can Play that talks about respect in the locker room and trying to make sure that it's a healthy place for all. And it doesn't mean, again, that there can't be crude language or any of this, but it's about trying to figure out what culture works for the members of it and giving safe places for people to go to opt out and to affect that culture if it's not working. So I do think, we can't look at these topics from a surface level and just look at what language. You and I have at times ridiculed some of the attempts to do that, where some of the soccer clubs internationally have come up with a list of words that can and can't be said in the locker room. And that was done top down, not from a commitment of the players. Those things feel artificial because you'll find a new word to replace it if the sentiment is there. So, trying to figure out what locker room culture is all about, as you and I have talked about a number of times, it really is something that needs to be cultivated, checked in on, have processes around it to alter it and circle back to make sure it is productive along the way too.
Right. Well, I mean, it ties back into that point we made in other contexts, not just the locker room, but one of the assumptions we talked about before was you have to let players fight in practice because you don't want to stifle their aggression. Right. And what we saw with the LeGarrette Blunt incident at the University of Oregon when he hit the Boise State player, Byron Hout, was that all of a sudden after that, there was like, wait a second, why do we encourage players to be that aggressive at practice? Why do they have to do that? Because the assumption is that they're going to somehow do this in practice, and then they're not going to do it in the game. They're going to know where to draw the line. It used to be an assumption that we had to have scrimmaging in practice every day. Right. And then Paul Brown came along and said, no, we're teaching technique most of the time and they'll still be plenty tough on Sunday. So I think there's a lot of assumptions we make because we assume sports is such a unique primal culture that every aspect of it has to be primal. But the other half of it is, and you see this especially the higher athletics goes at the college or professional level, it's an incredibly complex cerebral and social relationship that occurs. And so you have to balance the primal needs of the environment with those cerebral and social needs of the environment.
Yeah, well said, Ken. Thank you again for a great conversation. I appreciate it, and this is a lot of fun as always.
Thank you, Josh.